I'm here with Brandon Havard, who was kind enough to bring an iPhone XS Max so we could play with it and test out the camera today.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my phone as quickly as I wanted to, so Brandon was kind enough to let me use his and even unbox it. I didn't really have time to do the full deep dive review I would have liked to, and instead I spent a day focused on testing different aspects of the new camera. Hey Brandon, what are you looking to find out about this new iPhone camera?
I'd like to know about low light capabilities. They really like to show off the brighter conditions in the keynote. And besides that, I'd like to know about that variable aperture. Not sure how good or usable that feature is, but you know, we'll see.
Every year, Apple wants the iPhone to have new tentpole camera features that they can talk a lot about. This year, in 2018, are some of the biggest changes we've seen year over year in a long time. So quickly, I'll list what those changes are, and then we're gonna look at the results. All of the biggest changes come from Apple's new image signal processing, which comes from the huge updates to the neural engine. This leads to a lot of small changes for image quality, but the biggest one is what they call Smart HDR. In the keynote, they mentioned there's a new sensor on the front-facing camera, but surprisingly, they didn't talk about the rear camera having a 30% larger sensor, which is a huge jump. And this means that each pixel on the sensor can receive more data, and I think it's leading to a lot of the biggest improvements we've seen on the camera. They also forgot to mention the rear lens is a little bit wider, but they did talk about that portrait mode now has variable aperture, which you can change after you've taken the photo. Starting with the selfie camera, there's a lot more dynamic range thanks to Smart HDR, which especially means that you lose less detail in the highlights. And a surprise feature is that there also seems to be some default skin smoothing going on. And this feature represents a theme in some of the camera updates that they're really going after images that will look good to the widest possible audience. If you work as a photographer, which is how I make a living, you'd always want to add these effects afterwards only if you want them. It should always be a choice. But most people will never get around to making that choice. So Apple's making some processing decisions that a lot of people really like right out of the camera, but you can't really go and undo them.
Some of the biggest camera changes in the XS are to the self-facing camera, which is now stabilized. How stable is this? It's also a little bit faster, should be better in low light.
I'm really impressed by this image stabilization. You can see a little bit of artifacting with it, but that's totally worth it. The effect is that it's much smoother video, so when you're walking and recording a selfie, it looks way better.
This is actually a three-way collaboration here. Anya, my wife, is going to be modeling for some of our test photos, and I want to compare the XS Max, 10 and the 7, because most of us really upgrade every 2 years anyway.
Now if we look at the rear camera, it's got the same megapixels as it has for a few years, but comparing it to the iPhone 7, we can still see some serious improvements in sharpness and detail. And compared to the iPhone 10, it's kind of similar, but these cameras have already been doing great in good lighting for years now. And besides, sharpness and megapixels have never been as important as dynamic range. And dynamic range is so important because you can still see that difference even from an image thumbnail. Smart HDR is Apple's way of getting way more detail in the highlights and shadows. We've had HDR for a while, it's already been doing a lot of these things, but this is really taking it to the next level. It's combining a ton of images. Most of them are underexposed to save the highlights, and it also takes one that is overexposed to bring back the shadows. And when I first took some of these photos, my impression was that they felt a little bit flat, like it took a bit of the contrast away, and I wasn't really loving it. But once I started editing them, I really noticed that it brings back a lot of detail that you couldn't recover with the older phones. But you should be aware that with all this computational photography, there is some room for weirdness. This is something I saw on the Google Pixel 2 as well. When it's doing really extreme dynamic range pushes, it'll make a kind of over-filtered image that kind of looks like a painting. It looks too fake. If you notice this start to happen, tapping on the screen and adjusting the exposure can really help resolve it. Or I'll probably find myself using third-party apps a little more often in these extreme situations, just so I can force the camera to do exactly what I want it to. Portrait mode is a feature I didn't end up using a lot in my iPhone X. That's probably because I have bigger cameras that can do depth of field for real, but I realize most users don't, and so the effect that they get out of here can make it look like you're using a much more expensive camera, and that's really cool. Apple's made some advancements in their depth mapping so that they can see more of how far away subjects are, and this has led to a much more beautiful and realistic bokeh or blur in the background of the photo. However, the way it cuts out the subject is similar, and it'll still make mistakes around ears and glasses and hair. I'm really curious to see how the iPhone XR is doing this, because it's doing it with the single lens, similar to what the Google Pixel was doing. And I was kind of surprised that they couldn't do that as well on the iPhone XS. Like, why isn't it able to use the wide angle lens and just do wide angle portrait mode. I guess we're gonna need to wait and see about that. Low light is where I saw some of the most impressive changes in this camera, but before we look at that, I've got to tell you this video is brought to you by Audible, and I've been using Audible forever. I don't know exactly how long it's been, but I just checked and I have 295 books in my library. Audible has always been one of the most valuable resources for me in learning about new ideas and having time to go through literature, which I definitely don't have time to read on my own. I need somebody else to read it for me. The best thing is that I spend almost all of my time that I'm editing photos also listening to audio content, so I'm able to absorb way more. And I've got a few recommendations if you're interested in Apple. I'm about to finish Small Fry by Lisa Brennan Jobs, who is Steve Jobs' daughter. It's a really unique perspective on a story that I thought I already knew. And the next one I'm about to read is Creative Selection by Ken Kashenda. It's all about being a software engineer inside of Apple during those golden years where Steve Jobs was making his huge comeback. So to start your 30-day exclusive free trial and download a free book of your choice, go to audible.com/Stallman or text Stallman to 500-500. And honestly, check out either of these books. They've been fantastic.
The sun's gone down. Let's do some low light tests.
In darker environments, this new sensor really shines, and you can see how much better the iPhone XS camera has really gotten. Even before I zoom into the image, I can see that there's way more dynamic range in the brightest parts of the image, like inside windows at night. But then when I zoom in, I can see that there's also way more detail being preserved. And this isn't just sharpening being added to the photo. This is sensor detail. This is additional data that we wouldn't have without these camera improvements. This is the image quality race right now. From full frame DSLRs down to phones, they all need better high ISO performance and more dynamic range. And the iPhone XS has both. Overall, we're seeing a real jump in image quality here, especially if you're upgrading from an iPhone 7 or an iPhone 6S, you're gonna see a significant difference. But I kind of expected that, like 2 or 3 years is a normal upgrade and cameras would get better over that time. So I'm impressed that it is actually a little better than the iPhone X, that I would even notice that difference. And now I'm excited to see the iPhone XR, which looks like it's going to be incredible image quality for a lower price. So for more information about that and photography in general, go to stallmanpodcast.com. We're going to go into way more detail about all these things. And don't forget to go check out Brandon Havard. He's got a video that we shot that same day. Thanks for watching.